More so than any thinker in our tradition, Arendt took it upon herself to explore and articulate what it meant to think and to transmit thinking in a world where the traditions of thought and education had failed to prevent the most heinous crimes and were failing to keep in existence the world we have in common. It was, as you see in the quote that I have on the screen, ultimately out of love of the world and making a dedication for the world to be a home for human beings during the brief time that we share on this planet, that she persevered till her dying days, in fact her dying minutes, in the business of thinking. The first paragraph of her final book on judgment was found in the typewriter just when Arendt died. Now, one can do a grave disservice to a thinker by insisting that their ideas have something to say about our times. But in Arendt's case, identifying the relevance of her thought to the crises of the moment requires no act of intellectual contortion. Already in the 1950s and 60s, she wrote with frightening prescience about the ways in which we were turning politics into economics and allowing our faculty of reason to be denigrated into a faculty of calculation. She wrote about the challenge of finding a moral compass in a world where traditional rules of morality were no longer experienced as binding, about the atomisation of human beings and the loss of our ability to enter together in the business of creating a world that we might share. She wrote about the destruction of the world as a home, both politically and environmentally. And importantly, what I'm going to focus on tonight, she wrote about the role that thinking and education might play in preserving and creating the conditions in which thought and creativity would continue to be live possibilities for human beings. Of course, many thinkers have oriented their thought to the great crises of the 20th century, but what marks Arendt out from the others is her exceptional courage and boldness in admitting that the traditions of thought that we had inherited were in the main ill-equipped to meet the completely unprecedented constellations of the present. In this sense, beyond the substance of her thought, the performance of thinking in the face of the new and the present is something that we might take up ourselves as we face crises that have no precedent in human history. Certainly, as someone who had begun to read Kant and Kierkegaard at the age of 14, and who described a week reading Plotinus and Schelling as a week of great laziness in a letter that she wrote to her friend Mary McCarthy, Arendt had a deep love and respect for the great thinkers of the Western tradition. Indeed, philosophers, theologians, poets, novelists, from ancient Greece to her own contemporaries, crowd the pages of her books as her constant interlocutors. But with a vehemence available perhaps only to a young Jewish woman whose philosophy teacher had subsequently allied his thought with Nazism, she condemned and rejected the philosophical tradition in which thinking and action for the love of the world of human beings had apparently so violently parted company. In a world where the mechanisation of life was depriving human beings of their humanity, indeed in a world where the absence of thought had, as Arendt saw it, made possible the annihilation of millions of human beings, the business of thinking had to be the business of taking responsibility for the world. The stakes were simply too high for thinking to indulge in abstractions and the responsibility too great for thinkers to remove themselves from the world as it appeared in the space and time in which we found ourselves. Before I go any deeper in exploring Arendt's critique of the Western philosophical tradition, I want to pause for a moment and speak about Arendt herself, lest I already fall into the trap that she was so critical of speaking about her as if she was some disembodied brain that just existed nowhere. To understand the type of thinker that Arendt was and to understand how she came to think about thinking, we need to remember that she was intervening in a particular historical moment, and she saw herself as intervening in a particular historical moment. Beginning her career as a thinker in the mid-20th century, she had an acute experience of the failure of the project of the Enlightenment and of modernity. In her immediate world, the Shoah had ripped apart the myth of European civilization, and beyond this immediate experience, she was acutely alive to the ways in which the pace and obsession of progress had rendered marginal the tradition and meaning that she'd inherited. Standing from this place, literally in the graveyard of Hitler's genocide and the unceasing piles of rubble upon rubble of Benjamin's progress, she had the presence to recognise that traditional modes of thinking and pre-existing frameworks for interpretation were useless in making sense of what was going on. More importantly, they were impotent when it came to giving us access to creating a world that might be different. Even more damningly, she identified the models of thinking that had come down through the Western tradition as themselves part of the pathology that made possible the horrors of the 20th century. Writing in the wake of the Shoah and in face of the rise of communist totalitarianism, what Arendt saw was thus first that traditional sources of moral guidance no longer shield us from our own worst possibilities, and second, that the Enlightenment had itself allowed us to substitute rationalisation or mechanical thinking for true thinking, leaving us atomised and hollowed out of those human capacities that we needed to make the world a home for ourselves and for each other. God was dead, or at least astonishingly silent, and we had seen how far human laws could stray from anything resembling morality. Facing up to this reality entailed looking elsewhere to find a moral compass. As she was so fond of saying, we must learn to think without banisters, relinquishing those categories and formulas that are deeply imagined in our mind, but whose basis of experience has long been forgotten and whose plausibility resides in their intellectual consistency rather than in their adequacy for actual events. We must assume, she reminded us, the boldness of mind to think and judge without the pre-existing props that have in the past given us safe passage. Speaking from this place, she saw her work as articulating an understanding of thinking that might provide us with ways of acting radically different than those she saw around her, first in Germany in the 1930s, but later in the United States in the 40s, 50s and 60s. So what is this business of thinking for the world that she was on about? And what was it that she saw pathological in our tradition of thought? How could she possibly draw a line between Plato, through Descartes, and even Marx to Eichmann, and those others in her midst who may not have committed the grave crimes of the 20th century, but who had, at the very least, coordinated themselves, as she said? So let's turn for a moment to what Arendt thought it was to think. First, thinking requires us to be present to the world as it appears to each of us. That, of course, is our world, not her world, but this is the world out of which she would have urged us, our thinking, to come, not standing above the world, but with the world in which we're embroiled. As she wrote in the preface to her collection of essays Between Past and Future, this is one of my very favourite Arendt quotes, thought itself arises out of the incidents of living experience and remains bound to them as the only guideposts by which it takes its bearing. Or, as she put it more colloquially in an interview that she gave for French television in 1964, I do not believe that any thought process is possible without personal experience. Every thought is an afterthought, a reflection on some matter or event. Isn't that so? So here we have one of the keys to Arendt's approach to thinking, and correlatively, one of her quintessential criticisms of traditional modes of thought. Thinking requires a confrontation with reality, immersing oneself in reality of one's own life as it actually occurs in time and space. Correlatively, ideas or conclusions that follow from pre-existing abstractions, formulas or laws, which tell us how it is, not only fall short of real thinking, they represent a grotesque and dangerous distortion and avoidance of reality. As we'll see in a few moments when I come back to speak about Eichmann, Arendt understood the source of Eichmann's evil not as malice, but as the failure to think for himself, and the assumption that it was sufficient to apply a law, in his case Hitler's law, to the reality that appeared before him. Building on this notion that thinking arises from lived experience, Arendt similarly rejected the idea that one could divide the world up into events on the one hand and our experience of events on the other. All being is being in the world as it appears to us, where concrete objects always already have meaning, and human subjectivity is always already bound with objects of experience. Now, to illustrate that somewhat abstract point, I want to quote one of my very favourite passages from Arendt's. It's a response that she wrote, a letter that she wrote, just after she'd published The Origins of Totalitarianism. Eric Voegelin, who is another political philosopher, wrote a review of the book in which, amongst other things, he was critical of Arendt's excessive emotion and involvement, something that he thought overshadowed the essential nature of the events that she was describing. And I'll quote her response at some length. "I parted quite consciously from the tradition of sine ira et studio, without anger or fondness, of whose greatness I was well aware. And to me, this was a methodological necessity connected with my particular subject matter. Let us suppose that the historian is confronted with excessive poverty in a society of great wealth. The natural reaction of such conditions is one of anger and indignation, because these conditions are against the dignity of man. If I describe these conditions without allowing my indignity to interfere, I have lifted this particular phenomenon out of its context in human society and have thereby robbed it of part of its nature, deprived it of one of its important inherent qualities. For to arouse indignation is one of the qualities of excessive poverty, insofar as poverty occurs amongst human beings. This has nothing to do with sentimentality or moralising, although of course either can be a pitfall for the author. If I moralised or I became sentimental, I simply didn't do well what I was supposed to do, namely to describe the totalitarian phenomenon as occurring not on the moon, but in the midst of human society." The words are so wry that one can easily miss the gravity of what was at stake here. One can see, though, following my earlier remarks, that what she was rejecting was the fundamental ontology or theory of being of Western philosophy. The world does not exist as an object that we then perceive, adding our subjective perspective to what is actually there. Rather, our being there, our beholding or making sense or making use of part of the world is an essential part of the world, in as much as it is the world of human beings. In this regard, she not only rejected the classical idea of the subject standing outside the objective world and looking in, she was also rejecting one of the fundamental dichotomies of Western thought between being and appearance. According to this distinction, what actually is, what is most true, what has essential being, is not what appears, but rather exists as in some type of timeless essence, deep inside, behind, above, or beyond what appears to us. Perhaps most clearly illustrated in Plato's allegory of the cave, this model insists that we approach truth only by recognising the illusory nature of what appears in time and space, thereby devaluing the latter as a poor imitation for true being. For appearances, unlike essences, are shifting and subject to our perspectives, and thus, so the argument runs, they distract or distort being as such, which is always sealed off in a realm protected from the vagaries of the world and human beings. What's really important to get across here is that what is at issue here for Arendt are not the finer points of epistemology or ontology that we might rave about in some obscure philosophical journal. For Arendt, this apparently innocent model of thought as an activity perfected only through eschewing our being in the world with each other is far from innocent. In fact, she identified it as part of the background for the pathologies of the 20th century. I'll come back to how she connected this model of truth and thinking with totalitarianism and the loss of humanity in a moment. But once again, I want to return to Arendt and how thought emerged in her world. Let us remember, because we all too easily forget, that the radical turn that she took in her thinking and understanding the business of thinking was bound with her own experiences as the guideposts by which it took its bearing. So born to an assimilated secular Jewish family in Hanover in 1906, Arendt was principally brought up by her mother, Martha, who you can see here, after her father, Paul, died when she was just 7. Already as a child, Hannah developed a great love of philosophy, reading Kant and Kierkegaard in her mid-teens and forming a Greek study group that met in her room when she rejected the school's insistence that she attend Greek class at 8 a.m, having a lifelong habit she'd already begun then of wanting to spend the first hours of her day alone with a few cups of coffee. This streak of fierce independence continued to surface in her family and school life, and at 16, she was, a woman to my own heart, expelled from school after she organised a boycott against a teacher who she considered had spoken to her rudely. Her mother Martha took her side, always good to have a mother on the side of rebellion. Arendt left school but was permitted to study classics and theology as a special student at the University of Berlin, and she only went back to her school for permission to take the Abitur, the entrance exam, which she did in 1923. Attracted by the extraordinary reputation of the so-called magician of philosophy, in 1924 she began her university studies at Marburg with Martin Heidegger. 2 years later, following her now infamous romantic relationship with Heidegger, she left Marburg to study with Karl Jaspers in Heidelberg. Jaspers was to remain her most important, at least acknowledged teacher beyond Heidegger throughout her life. He remained a parental figure and interlocutor all throughout her work. At Heidelberg, she continued to integrate her love of philosophy and theology, completing in 1929 with her dissertation on love in St. Augustine. Of course, in the late 1920s, philosophy and theology weren't the only things that were happening in Germany, and as a vibrant young Jewish woman, Arendt found herself drawn from the circle of philosophers into the circle of Jewish politics. By the early 30s, with the rise of fascism and Nazism in Germany, the split in her attention had become more radical, and as she put it in her interview with Günter Gauss, she turned from philosophy to politics. So this is this interview that she did for television in 1964, and she starts off the interview by, when Gauss calls her a philosopher, she says, "Excuse me, but I'm not a philosopher." So he asks her, "Is there a definite event in your memory that dates your turn to the political?" And she answers, "I would say February 27th, 1933, the burning of the Reichstag, and the illegal arrests that followed that same night, the so-called protective custody. As you know, people were taken to Gestapo cellars or to concentration camps. This was an immediate shock for me, and from that moment I felt responsible. That is, I was no longer of the opinion that one can simply be a bystander." And she continues a few moments later, "I lived in an intellectual milieu, and among the intellectuals, Gleichschaltung, coordination, was the rule. I thought it had to do with their profession, with being an intellectual. It belongs to the essence of intellectuals that one fabricates ideas about everything. They were trapped by their own ideas." Here I think we quite distinctly hear how it was the confrontation with the world literally exploding in front of her life that caused the radical shift in Arendt's action and thinking. Picture of her with her first husband, Günther Stern. In particular, she immediately involved herself in politics, first by opening her and Günther Stern's apartment to the Underground Railroad that was running for German Jews and communists to get out of Germany. and then by gathering evidence on Nazi anti-Semitism for the German Zionist organisation, for which she was briefly imprisoned. Later, when she fled to Paris, she worked for an organisation that was preparing young people to immigrate to Palestine. At the same time, and importantly, one sees shifts in her thinking and the roots of what was to become a fully fledged critique of philosophy of truth that she articulated later most powerfully in her book, The Human Condition. As I noted earlier, Plato's image of the cave and the need to escape the cave in order to find truth in the realm of pure, transcendent, timeless ideas provided both the first historical moment and the key exemplar of Arendt's complaint against philosophy. Now, if she actually had a more subtle reading of Plato than that, but we can come back to that in question time if you like. In Plato, as Arendt read him, or more importantly, as she thought he functioned as axiomatic in the Western tradition, we see the emergence of the concept of reason understood as true insight gained not in dialogue or argument, as it was for Socrates, but in the contemplation of timeless ideas. Ideas, moreover, that were only accessible to the few and only by leaving the darkness of the world as it was experienced in space and time. This basic dichotomy between truth that's to be found outside of experience and the darkness of our common world was for Arendt to prove faithful to our traditions of politics and for our understanding ourselves as human beings. She powerfully articulates this dichotomy in the opening words of her essays, essay, Tradition in the Modern Age, which I have up here. Our tradition of modern thought has its definite beginning in the teachings of Plato. In the Republic's allegory of the cave, Plato described the sphere of human affairs, all that belonged to the living together of men in a common world, in terms of darkness, confusion and deception, which those aspiring to true being must turn away from and abandon if they are to discover the clear sky of ideas. Once we accepted this basic split between the obscurity of the experience of human beings in the world on the one hand and the philosopher's discovery of reason beyond the world on the other, we had established the template for authoritarian politics. We had lost our ability to recognise that human beings' experience in the world has its own irreducible dignity. Apparently benign when compared with other forms of more violent coercion, reason, thus understood, was nevertheless both coercive and hostile to phenomenal reality, the lived truths of the many. Here's an excerpt from her essay, What is Authority? It was after Socrates' death that Plato began to discount persuasion as insufficient for the guidance of men and seek something liable to compel them without using external means of violence. Very early in his search, he must have discovered that truth, namely the truth we call self-evident, compels the mind, and that this coercion, though it needs no violence to be effective, is stronger than persuasion or argument. The real danger lay, in other words, not in the philosopher's contemplation of timeless ideas, but in his or her journey back to the world, where she might decide, now as the philosopher king, to use these transcendent ideas of reason as the yardsticks against which to measure the world, and against which the world should be measured. One can see the line that she is drawing here between despotic truth and reason and political despotism. Again, this is from What is Authority? The ideas relate to the varied multitude of things concrete in the same way that the yardstick relates to the varied multitude of things measurable, or as the rule of reason relates to the varied multitude of concrete events that can be subsumed under it. Likewise, the essential characteristic of specifically authoritarian forms of government, that the source of authority which legitimates the exercise of power, like the law of nature or the commands of God, must not be man-made, goes back to this applicability of the ideas in Plato's political philosophy. Her language is a little difficult there, but what you can see she's saying is it's this notion that there is a yardstick which is not made by human beings in time and space and between each other in our difference, but which is imported from an absolute elsewhere, becomes the template for authoritarian politics. Why was this model of politics, one might ask, as the application of absolute laws, so repugnant to Arendt? Now, the answer to that question requires far more time than I have tonight, but I want to talk about two interrelated answers, one in terms of the consequences for politics and the other in terms of the consequences for humans. The consequence for politics is that the realm of the political has been deprived of all that is noble about it. Politics, rather than being a sphere of human action, has been reduced to a sphere for the implementation of rules. Within the imagination of Western thought, as Arendt read it, the ideal political order is one in which a perfectly harmonised rule has been achieved. It is, to go back to Arendt's analysis of Plato, the imperfect human space rendered more perfect by being aligned by ideas imported from elsewhere. The truly political, by contrast, and as Arendt invites us to reimagine it, was, on the contrary, that sphere in which human beings are able to act in each other's presence, enacting not what is dictated elsewhere, but our own humanity as we grapple together in the world that appears before us. Politics, freed from its secondary status, would then be the quintessential realm of human action in space and time, where we come together not under the sway of capital T truth, but to enact the business of human beings, to reveal who we are to each other in our words and our deeds. Now, the perplexity, particularly watching Australian politics at the moment, the perplexity that you might be experiencing trying to understand how she could possibly think of such inspiring notions as self-revelation as politics is not simply the odd use of her words, though it certainly is that. It's also testament to the accuracy of Arendt's diagnosis of the fate of the political. That politics means rule and that freedom begins where politics ends seems to us to follow as a matter of course from the definition of those terms. But what Arendt had in mind when she spoke about politics or when she spoke about action, which was for her synonymous with the political realm, was a particular way of being and acting in which we do not enact what already exists as a template waiting to be made manifest. Rather, it is the realm where we come together, and in the world that arises, when we come together, we bring our words and actions into existence. Arendt often used the analogy of playing an instrument, playing the flute or dancing to get across what she had in mind here. The performance exists in the space between the performer and the audience, not leaving a product behind, but revealing the who of those who are present in the performance itself. That's what she meant by action. That's what she meant by the political sphere. And in this sense, at stake in the loss of the political was not merely the loss of one sphere of human activity, but the possibility of our experiencing ourselves as human beings at all. And here we come to the burning heart of Arendt's thought, the passionate recognition that what is most precious in human existence, but also most fragile, is this rare capacity to bring the new into existence. Politics, as she articulated it, mattered because deprived of the space in which we might come together as different and equal, we are also deprived of the opportunity to live this dimension of our humanity. To convey this notion of who human beings are, Arendt throughout her life quoted Augustine's phrase, "Initium ergo ut esset creatus est homo, ante quem nullus fuit." And I particularly like this paraphrase which a philosopher Hamacher gave of that quote. The creation of man is not the beginning of something that, once created, exists in its essence, develops, remains or perishes, but rather the beginning of a being that itself has the ability to begin. It is the beginning of beginning, the beginning of beginning. So long as we are condemned or we condemn ourselves to merely enacting what was already established in a higher realm of the true, we are ultimately no more than cogs in a process wheel, albeit if the production is law and reason. To be the source of the new in time, we need a realm where our humanity and our humanity alone, in all its imperfection, is the ultimate measure of its own performance. Of course, shearing human action off from absolute standards in this way doesn't make for a safe life, and Arendt was keenly aware of the dangers to which we would inevitably be exposed. Certainly, certainty, predictability and sovereignty could no longer be guaranteed. Once we allow the truth of human affairs can emerge only from the pell-mell of our being together and allowing what will emerge to emerge, we can no longer control what that will be. Now, you can imagine how horrifying this prospect is from the point of view of a worldview that defines sovereignty as the ideal of the free will, independent from others and eventually prevailing against them, Hobbesian liberalism. Turning this idea on its head and insisting that freedom requires that we place ourselves into the unpredictability of an authentic conversation with others. Arendt countered this view with the assertion that if men wish to be free, it is precisely sovereignty that they must renounce. But lest we think that Arendt was an anarchist, as much as she wished to make space for the possibility of the new, she also treasured the world that had to be protected from the onslaught of unpredictability. She thus insisted that we needed structures, laws, traditions and institutions that would provide us with some bearings as we entered the unpredictable seas of politics and action. Here I'm particularly fond, this isn't a quote of Arendt's, it's a quote from Robert Bolt's A Man for All Seasons, placed in the mouth of Thomas More. And when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide? The laws all being flat. This country's planted thick with laws from coast to coast, and if you cut them down, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? So as much as Arendt was enamoured of the possibility of the radically new, she was also keenly aware of the need for structures to keep the world in which the new would be possible in existence. Promises in the form of constitutions, laws and the customs of citizenship were for her the necessary counterbalance to and condition of the survival of unpredictability. And forgiveness was the practice that we would need to adopt in order to move past the mistakes we would inevitably make. But promises and forgiveness, constitutions and good laws were only ever world structures that we human beings had erected for functional purposes. Ultimately, they had to be for the sake of our experiencing our humanity in time and with each other. It was this analysis of the death of the political and the dangers posed to our humanity by the subsumption of politics into the enactment of inhuman truths that provided Arendt with the keys to understand totalitarianism, first in Nazi Germany and then in Soviet Russia. Building on the conflation of truth and sovereignty with an absolute law, the unique and novel move that totalitarian forms of rule made was to claim that they were driven by and thus merely operating in the service of the immutable laws of nature. In the case of Nazism, what was being made manifest through Nazi rule was the natural and thus inevitable perfection of man. That this entailed the elimination of inferior forms of life was unfortunate but inevitable. In the case of Stalinism, what was being manifest was the natural and again inevitable development of society from capitalism to socialism to communism, articulated in Marx's observation of the laws of political economy. In this context, Arendt appositely quoted the description of Marx that Engels gave at his funeral, and I quote, "Just as Darwin discovered the laws of development of organic nature, Marx discovered the law of development of human history." In the face of such laws, albeit they're remaining obscure to us ordinary human beings, our role was simply to bend to their inevitability. Now, I had a rather long quote from Origins that I was going to read you, but I think I might leave it because it's a little difficult to understand. But basically what she's saying in this quote is that if you listen to Hitler or Stalin's rhetoric, they spoke about prophecies that they were giving of what inevitably had to come and the dying races that inevitably had to die out, thereby giving what was actually their choices and their politics the aura of inevitability, and thereby crushing all possibility for argument, because if it's science or if it's natural, what can you do about it? To be fully effective, however, totalitarian rule, I don't like that word, do I? Totalitarian rule had to do more than appeal to the laws of nature. It also had to destroy the relations between human beings in which we might build alternative forms of power and solidarity. Drawing once again on her understanding of politics as the realm of human plurality and spontaneous action, it was by destroying the possibility of politics and turning men into atomised and alienated individuals that they were rendered completely vulnerable, like fragments of material to be assumed as mere moments in history's inevitable movement. We can thus begin to see how the loss of the political realm in which spontaneous action is possible was simultaneously the loss of the possibility of our being human. As politics and action become less and less likely, totalitarian rule swells in its power over us, and we in turn lose the remaining resources we might have to resist. Sorry, I need some water. For Arendt believed that our humanity, our power and our freedom lie always and only in our relations with each other. Here we might distinguish for her on the one hand from the liberal tradition as it emerged from Hobbes, where the most perfect freedom was where we get other people out of the way. Or on the other hand from Rousseau's republicanism, where the will of the individual is perfected by becoming part of the will of the all. Skirting either alternative, Arendt insists that we can only experience our humanity, our capacity to bring something new into existence, our creativity or our power when we come together while preserving our distinction as individuals. This way of being in the world, which she called plurality, was also what made it possible for us to keep the world into existence, because the world, remember, for Arendt, was not something that existed there for us to experience, but was what lay between us. Correlatively, as we looked outside the world for truth or law or the forces that would give meaning for the world, as long as we looked outside the world for truth or law or meaning, we deprived ourselves of this unique access to human existence, the access that we find only when we come together to discuss, to act and to judge. I think you find the clearest picture of what she meant by humanity and politics in the loving descriptions that she gave of the people who represented exemplars of such humanity. So of the 18th century playwright, I think that's the wrong quote. Of the 18th century playwright Lessing, she writes, because Lessing was a completely political person, he insisted truth can only exist where it is humanised by discourse. Every truth outside of this area, no matter whether it brings man good or ill, is inhuman in the literal sense of the word, but not because it might arouse men against one another and separate them. Quite to the contrary, it is because it might have the result that all men would suddenly unite in a single opinion, so that out of the many opinions, one might emerge, as though not men in their infinite plurality, but man in the singular, one species and exemplars were to inhabit the earth. Should that happen, the world, which can only form in the interspaces between men in all their variety, would vanish altogether. Celebrating the very thing that distressed philosophers, Lessing rejoiced in the fact that truth, as soon as it was uttered, just became one more opinion to be disputed, turned and refuted. And he rejoiced at this precisely because the ever-receding nature of truth made space for discourse between human beings, and herein lies our humanity. Arendt's wonderful essay on Lessing, which she gave when she accepted the Lessing Prize in Hamburg in 1959, appears in a wonderful collection of her essays called Men in Dark Times, and I like to think of this book as the counterpoint to her book on Eichmann. So Eichmann in Jerusalem was, if you wish, the anatomy of how it is that in times of moral crisis, human beings coordinate themselves with evil. Men in Dark Times is the anatomy of how it is that in times of moral crisis, some people resist. The twin answers that she gives to this all-important question, how do you resist when there is madness all around you, both rest, as one might expect, with the idea of plurality. In the first instance, plurality between human beings. In the second instance, plurality within myself. To illustrate this, she conducts a thought experiment placing Lessing as the protagonist. She takes Lessing and hypothetically places him in the time of the Third Reich, so about 200 years later, a bit less. And she asks, what would he have said if it had been proven to him as a matter of scientific truth that the Nazi doctrine of the racial superiority of the Germans and the racial inferiority of the Jews was correct? Now remember, he can't appeal to pre-existing moralities, either religious or philosophical, because science has now trumped the realm of truth. He suggests that Lessing would have returned the question with a question. Would any such doctrine, however convincingly, prove to be worth the sacrifice of so much as a single friendship between men? What saves us from our darkest times, what provides us with some hope of moral orientation, is humanitas, as the Greeks called it, achieved through the discourse of friendship. Philanthropia, made manifest in our desire and our willingness to share the world with other people. And here, those of you who have read Eichmann in Jerusalem might recall that at the end of her book on Eichmann, she pronounces her own death sentence on Eichmann, not adopting the reasons of the Israeli judges, but rather giving her own reasons. And she suddenly takes on the first person and pronounces as follows: just as you, Eichmann, supported and carried out a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of a number of nations, as though you and your superiors had any right to determine who should and who should not inhabit the world, we find that no one, that is, no member of the human race, can be expected to want to share the earth with you. That is the reason, and the only reason, that you must hang. I love it. She's just having a little dig at the Israeli court at the same time. In other words, their reasons were not the right reasons. The second answer to her question brings us back to where I began, Arendt's contribution to the business of thinking. Now, as many of you know, and as I've already mentioned in passing, her observations of Eichmann during his trial in Jerusalem led Arendt to conclude that human beings in the main don't commit evil acts during times of moral madness because they embrace the immorality actively as such. Rather, it's because they abdicated the work of thinking and judging. Now, you can only imagine how horrified Arendt, who had a lifelong love affair with Kant, felt when she heard Eichmann in the dock call himself a Kantian, and then explained that just as Kant had insisted that the moral imperative was to be found in obedience of the law of reason, his moral imperative was to be found in obedience to the law of Hitler. Generalising from Eichmann, she concluded that under circumstances of moral crisis, those who had once held fast to decent values were unreliable moral agents, for theirs was the habit of holding fast, not the habit of thinking. And moral values, as she had seen in her own life, could be changed overnight, like decorations in a shopping mall. I think if we see how quickly the absolute sanction against torture that we thought was an absolute moral value changed after 9/11, then we can see how quickly moral values can change. Irrespective of the content of the law or the moral precept, the point was that Eichmann didn't think. He didn't judge. He didn't act. He enacted. In several essays later in her life, Arendt dwelt on this question of how those who resisted differed in their thinking from those who coordinated. And what she concluded was that the difference lay neither in education nor culture nor in the superiority of values. Rather, as she put it in Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship, their criterion was a different one. They asked themselves to what extent they would be able to live in peace with themselves after having committed certain deeds. And they decided that it would be better to do nothing, not because the world would be changed for the better, but simply because only on this condition could they go on living with themselves. Arendt's move here was to bring the plurality that she insisted was the basis for humanising our action and judging into the space of the single person. Even in the absence of another, I can still, in true thinking, be engaged in a silent dialogue between me and myself. If I step into this inner plurality, I might, irrespective of the madness of the world around me, be able to resist evil. Now, in writing about this stopgap of thinking, Arendt was originally only thinking about the sources of morality in a world gone mad. She was talking about what happens when, unlike normal circumstances, the structures that we've built in the world, the laws, the relationships, the constitutions, no longer provide any bulwark against the madness of a morality gone crazy. She was looking for what can hold us when everything else is gone. Nevertheless, given that she lived through extraordinary times... Oh, I think that's wrong. Anyway, given that she lived through extraordinary transformations of European civilization, from what was held to be the heart of civilization to a theatre of publicly sanctioned mass murder, she understood that to guard ourselves against the seduction of evil, we must cultivate the habit of thinking. And thus she mused. Oh, I've lost a slide. Oh, no, it is. Sorry. Could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining and reflecting upon whatever happens to come to pass, regardless of the specific content and quite independent of results, could this activity be of such a nature that it conditions men against evil doing? With this, I would like to finish with the words of Lessing that Arendt quoted in her oration dedicated to him, for they are, I think, the finest dedication that I can give to her. May my ideas always be somewhat disjunct or even appear to contradict one another, if only they are ideas which readers or listeners will find material that stirs them into think for themselves. Thank you. I think Meredith has a mic.
Hi. I know it's a bit cliched today to ask of a thinker whether or not they basically endorse capitalist liberal democracy, but seriously, does Arendt basically endorse capitalist liberal democracy? Like, I ask this because she does critique Stalinism and Nazism, and does put forward a sort of ideal of what she would see politics or the political as being. And I'm just wondering whether she explicitly critiqued the state of politics in America or post-World War II Germany, for example.
In 1972, there was a conference in honour of her work that she attended, and someone asks her what her politics are. And she says, you know, I can't answer that question of whether I'm on the right or on the left, whether I'm a liberal or a conservative. Arendt was allergic to isms. I hope that I got that across, that the very idea of having a political ideology was completely abhorrent to her because that would prevent you thinking. Now, that said, she did have some wonderful critiques of kind of late capitalism in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, particularly the mechanisation of life and the effects of materialism in terms of our citizenship. So she wrote not extensively, but you can find in some of her later essays some real concerns about the way in which late capitalism led to the seduction of a type of a material existence in which our sense of being engaged citizens where we were making a world no longer seemed to matter. Hope that answers.
Thank you, Danny. That was actually very enlightening. And I mean, Arendt's been one of my heroines, I suspect, basically, because I tend to share her desire to always sort of be, in a sense, what she called the conscious pariah, the marginal person who wasn't part of movements. And it was nice finding somebody who justified that feeling of marginality. But I suppose one of the things that really interests me at the moment, and you've sort of half done it, and I'd be interested in other comments from the audience, is I started reading the intro to Men in Dark Times tonight before I came down here. And just in the introductory bit, there's a bit I can't remember the exact wording, but she talks about something which strikes me as being very much the current political situation, where she talks about how you organise, in a sense, the mob, as being people who've got no real politics, no real joining capacities, no real allegiances in any political way, but get drawn into a sort of political process and become part of that blob things. And given some of the arguments that are going on about what's been happening in Britain, and given what's happening here, I mean, I was listening to the High Court decision on the refugees and the absolute sort of antipathy around some of those sorts of things. And, you know, the way that we've got all of this conscious, whatever, the movements of no confidence or whatever, and all of those things now. That sort of critique of populism, of mindless populism, I think is extraordinarily relevant to the sort of politics of today. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people on the left are going into the very facile thing of assuming this is an anti-capitalist feeling, rather than using her, I think, much more subtle analyses of that sort of inability to find, you know, to think, to leave the space between oneself to think. And I was just wondering how far you feel that we should be using an Arendtian eye at the moment, because she actually comments on the difficulties of distinguishing between left and right that she saw back then, and it seems to me that seems to be fairly powerful now. So do you sort of think she is somebody that far more people should read instead of some of the facile crap that we're getting coming out at the moment?
I think the answer to that's pretty self-evident, absolutely. I mean, I touched on it a little bit but didn't go into it deeply, that if we see one side of the analysis of totalitarianism as being this assumption of the forces of nature, right? We're not doing it because we want to, we're not doing it because we hate Jews, we're not doing it because we believe in something, we're doing it because this is the way it has to be, right? So that's one side of totalitarianism. But the other side of it is, how do people have to be prepared so that they're vulnerable to that, right? And what she was saying is that the relations between us that can empower us to resist and say, actually, that's not the only way of seeing things. That if those bonds are broken down, and in this sense, she was very much in the tradition of a lot of kind of German Jewish writers of the earliest 20th century, this notion of anomie, but the atomization of human beings, right? And she said the same about what happened with the breakup of under imperialism in the early 20th century, that when we're rendered atomistic individuals with no relations, with no other sort of relations, these, you know, smaller groups of islands of civility, she called them, where the islands of civility, where the possibility of us talking to each other and making a world which is civilised for ourselves, well, those are broken down, then we're completely powerless to resist. And I think those two sides of understanding not just how do political elite work, but who are we that we're vulnerable to that? And I mean, I guess by way of answer, I would say I don't think it's just about reading Arendt. I also think it's about taking responsibility for what that means, right? That we can't, and I was going to talk about her work on civil disobedience in the late 1960s in the United States, but of course I didn't get time. She drew a distinction between conscience and civil disobedience, right? She didn't think that it was enough, and I love it, when she was 16, she didn't just go to the teacher herself, she organised a group, right? That's why she got expelled. She understood, I mean, this is basic kind of good left politics. She understood that we have to organise, not as a mob, we have to organise with this space between us so that we have the capacity to speak back to power, to speak in a way that's cogent, that can hold some sort of argumentative force. And, you know, frankly, given the messages that we're getting from the political elite at the moment, it shouldn't be particularly difficult.
But it can be. I mean, that's one of the things I've been sort of looking at some of the stuff around the intervention, the Aboriginal stuff. And I mean, in that sense, it's extraordinarily hard to butt in because there's assumption, you know, that thing about when you talk about it in that sort of, that thing about we know what the answers are. You get an extraordinary level of that happening at the same time, which is exactly that sort of thing. You know, this is the only way we can go. This is what we have to do.
Well, the rule of the experts.
Yes.
I mean, I'm constantly struck by every time, you know, there was a news report about 10 months ago I heard on domestic violence. And what did this news report say? What was the cost to the economy of domestic violence? Right? This translation of politics into economics has so deprived us of our ability to speak politically, and I think that's something that she reminds us of very harshly. I didn't mean that it's easy to organise. No. I meant that the messages are so facile that it shouldn't be that easy to argue against them.
I like that comment about the market value of, or the market damage of domestic violence. I was watching a news report last night about the floods in the US, and summing up the report, they said at the end, the damage is expected to be $40 billion.
What does that mean, by the way?
Which made it seem like that was kind of on the same level as the loss of 40 lives. But that's just a kind of side point. I wanted to point to kind of a difficulty in Arendt's thinking, despite my, as you know, my deep admiration and respect for Arendt. And that is in how she sees thinking and conscience as a criterion for morality, or as, well, she probably wouldn't want to like the word criterion. But the problem is, you know, the idea that this seems like an overly simplistic explanation for wrongdoing. I mean, to kind of parody it's like saying, well, you know, if the Nazis had really thought about it hard enough and looked themselves hard in the mirror, they would have seen that what they were doing was wrong, and they would have, you know, pulled back from performing these heinous acts. And that seems a little bit too glib to me. The problem there partly is that I think that the thinking that she's talking about is too subjective. So it's something that you do on your own. I mean, this is a problem that Arendt talks about in detail. So, I mean, the question is what are the shortcomings of that way of thinking about thinking and conscience in relation to morality? And, yeah, I mean, I think I was trying to get to something else, but... Yeah, I think that'll do. How can you kind of address that? I mean, because it seems like this is a return to using reason to work out morality. So how do you reconcile those?
I don't agree with the latter, but I think when you read any great thinker, and Arendt is clearly a great thinker, it's important to think about who else was in the room, right? What were the debates to which she was responding? And I think that's often a very important way to read her, because she can, as you say, seem partial in her analysis. But the person, one of the people in the metaphorical room to whom she was speaking was the one who said that evil was metaphysical, that evil was somehow inherent in the German people, that evil was about some timeless hatred against the Jewish people. So it was these other aspects of the origins of evil that I think, if we're going to have a capacious discussion of the origins of evil, we have to put those on the table as well, right? What she was saying is, but you're missing something. And this question of coordination, as she called it, was tremendously important to her. These people who, as she said, the ordinary German family man who just wanted to keep the meal on the table for his family, they were the people that she was really trying to understand. And I think it's that dimension of the source of evil that she was trying to get at. I absolutely agree with you. If you want to say, well, now we've got the answer, that's not... I don't think that's a fair reading of her, and I also think that leads us down a problematic path. I don't agree with you that she's looking to reason. Well, certainly not reason as she critiqued it, as something that exists outside herself. And what I tried to explain at the end, and perhaps not particularly well, was that this was an emergency measure, right? She's saying when this has gone, she actually did think that religious morality was probably pretty useful at one time. She wasn't a harsh secularist in that sense. But she said, when this has gone, when this has gone, when this has gone, when other people have gone, when I can't turn to my friend any longer to keep this space of plurality between us, when I can't turn to my interlocutor to try and work out what is sane in this insane world, is there something left? Is there something that I can do with myself that holds off the perpetration of evil? I think that you've got to read it in that way. And I think what's valuable about it, and again I tried to do this right at the end, is she then goes on to say what we need to do is cultivate the habit of thinking. Because you never know, right? You never know when you're going to lose it. In the 1920s in Germany, Benjamin, Arendt, they wouldn't have dreamt that they were going to be transported to concentration camps. This seemed like a pretty civilized place, right? So she says, because you never know what structures of the world are going to be taken away, you have to cultivate the habit of thinking. And I have to say, I think that's a pretty important message for those of us who are involved in education and are seeing our children go into, rote learning so that they can pass exams. The habit of thinking is something that we are sadly remiss at attending to.
What does Arendt say about the motivation of fear as a factor of standing by and doing nothing in the face of evil?
As far as I know, she doesn't say anything about it, is my very short answer. I mean, she does recognise that people were trying to protect themselves. I guess what's at issue to her is what's left when we protect ourselves. Is this a human world worth protecting?
Yeah, Dr. Sellemeyer, can I take this down a more esoteric direction for a moment? My sense from the way you spoke about Arendt is that she was also not what you might call a lightweight as a theological thinker. This notion of being and appearance, true being, mere appearance, and the way that that's actually enshrined in religion. You could actually say that for the most part, religions you could have an argument that they're taking people away from the world. Would she see that as a metaphysical fallacy? Would she see that as a fundamental metaphysical error that occurred at a particular time in history? What would she say about religions being what enshrines true being and diminishes and disparages mere appearance? or the world of human beings?
Well, she didn't answer that question, so I'll try and answer it in her place. I think that she would have, like her teacher Heidegger, distinguished between the possibility of theology and ontotheology, right? So what you're, sorry to translate that into English, ontotheology is, I love this phrase of a Christian theologian, David Armstrong, the idea that God is the biggest thing around, right? So God's there, all you have to do is look up, Psalm whatever, Deuteronomy whatever, and that'll give you the template for what you do, right? That model of theology as a prescription outside the world for how we live in the world was as repugnant to her as any other form of metaphysics which separated truth and the heart of being from what it is to be here together. But I don't think that she was so naive as to think that that was the only possibility that existed in the history of religions. And she was a scholar of Christianity. She was a scholar of Augustine in particular. She was not a scholar of Judaism. But I won't bore you with my great theories on the Jewish roots of Arendt's thought. But in fact, her ideas are extraordinarily close to what's known in the Western tradition as negative theology, right? God is not this, God is not this, God is not this. So there's one of my favourite pieces of Midrash, which I'll tell very quickly, where there's a bunch of rabbis and they're arguing about, firstly, how high does a tree have to be, and one of them is always disagreeing with the rest of them. And finally, they say, okay, well, let's hear the voice of God. And they listen to the voice of God, and God says, Reb David is correct and Reb Isaac is incorrect. And they get together and they say, too bad, we think Reb Isaac's correct. And the end of the story is God laughs and says, my children have defeated me, right? So this model of theology says, and it's actually in Deuteronomy, I put on my rabbinic hat now, the voice of God is not in the heavens that you might hear it, but here on earth between you. Right? So that was the theological model that she adopted, that we can understand God as something that exists over and above the world, or we can understand God as that which is never complete, right? That which is this ever-receding possibility of truth that we can't capture within the material space of any particular space and time, but is, as the wonderful French theologian called it, the infinite conversation, the infinite reading that we have in our conversation that we have with each other. So I think if you have that much more sophisticated understanding of a negative theological view of God, then you can align Arendt with it. But certainly any notion that the God of Christopher Hitchens, my favourite Antichrist, the God of Christopher Hitchens is certainly not a God that she would have liked to have hung around with. All my friends are asking questions now. I better get ready.
Hi, Danny.
Hi, Nick.
This is a great introduction to the multifaceted sides of... Is this thing on?
No, or across.
Or across it. Yeah, thanks. So I was interested in what you were saying at the beginning about how you must think from concrete experiences, and those concrete experiences serve as guideposts to thinking. And some of the background to Arendt's critique of philosophy that somehow sounds dissonant to me, because one way we can criticize the metaphysical tradition of Western philosophy is that it presents us a subject who confronts the world as though this, the world's out there, and we're bare subjects, and we kind of like just try to make sense of it, process it in various ways, as though the world is data. But when Arendt is talking about thinking in connection to experience, how would that be different? In other words, why would we not be bare subjects confronting, not this time, a great big metaphysical object, but this experience and that experience and that experience, and what are we bringing to that experience? And so that brings me to the question of plurality in Arendt. It seems to me that Arendt is also a normative thinker and not just a phenomenological thinker. It's not just getting attuned to something in experience that provokes thought, because plurality in Arendt isn't like what Rawls means by the fact of reasonable pluralism. That's an empirical fact of the matter that human beings disagree, and there's a level of disagreement that's irreducible. It's just you have to accept as reasonable. But for Arendt, plurality is also an ideal. It's a normative ideal. It's something we want to create, foster, preserve. So I'm just wondering, in other words, if it's enough to present Arendt as this phenomenological thinker offering a political phenomenology, if we do that, we miss that there are normative ideals she's working with, what Kant would call ideas of reason, which aren't anything like Platonic ideas of reason. I think that part of Arendt has to be put together with the political phenomenology part, but I could be wrong. Now, this is a long question, sorry.
I'll just respond to the first part first, where you said what's the difference between a phenomenological relationship with reality or still kind of standing against reality. I think that's kind of the phenomenological experience of being a human being, right? We kind of, at a certain point, we do feel like we're here and something's there. I think the difference is that we can be here, right? Let me give you, it might be a poor example, but it comes to mind. I don't know, those of you who saw Australian Story last night about David Hicks and our wonderful former Attorney General or Minister of Immigration, Philip Ruddock, was speaking about the fact that David had entered a guilty plea after 6 years in Guantanamo Bay. And he says, you know, what I see, or it might have been Alexander Downer, hard to tell the difference. He says, you know, what I see is that, you know, he was charged, he pleaded guilty, that's the end of the story, right? There you have somebody who is standing so goddamn far from reality that you really want to shove it up his ass, right? Sorry, like you really want to get some reality into that guy. He is judging from such a disembodied place that he can't be touched by the reality of what it is to be a human being in Guantanamo Bay after 6 years at all. Right, so that's an extreme example. She's not saying that the subjective experience of the human being who somehow feels this that, you know, I'm over here, can be dissolved. But she's saying, but you can get here, right? And I've got that wonderful quote where she says, you know, the problem with these old truths and old formulas is that we've forgotten the experience that gave rise to them in the first place. They probably were relevant once, but they're not relevant anymore. And so I think what she's inviting us to do, it's not as radical a break as she often polemically presents it. She's asking us to get here, right? She's asking us to get into space and time in the way that we think. There still will be the distance that you're talking about. Your second comment about her being a normative thinker. It's a hard dilemma when you're talking about Arendt, because she did have this normativity, which I think comes through in her sentencing most clearly in her sentencing of Eichmann. This notion that the ultimate value is that we share the world with other people. And so for her, this preservation of plurality was, I think, probably the moral trump card. That's what she always came back to. But, you know, everyone's got to have a moral... I think you've got to have some place from which you stand, I don't know if it's possible not to have some reasonably fixed point. And I think that her fixed point was probably around this idea of preserving plurality. There's a wonderful story that her literary executor told me, that in 2006, it was the anniversary of Arendt's birth, and so there were Arendt conferences everywhere. And we were talking, and he said, I've just been to this great Arendt conference. I really loved it because for once they weren't Arendt scholars who were arguing about what page the footnote was. They were theologians and sociologists, all different people. And what I really hate about the average Arendt conference is that people sit there and they argue about the contradictions in her work. What they don't understand is that she wanted to see the world from as many different perspectives as possible. She didn't want to be, that's why I put that quote up, she didn't want to be consistent. She wanted to preserve plurality. And I think, again, if you kind of come back to what were the roots of her own experience, I think the annihilation of plurality, not only in the context of Nazi Germany, but generally as the kind of sway of modernity in which difference was just too much trouble, right? It's easier to manage everyone if we kind of all want the same things, we look alike. That's something that was very much informing her. So, yeah, I do think that's the moral sway in her work. I don't think that you can get away from that. I don't know if that really answers you, though.
What you have written up there looks like it would be actually quite a good epitaph for Plato. When you think of Plato arguing against himself and the dialectical situation he was in, think of the Symposium. One of the most moving speeches is Alcibiades, and being rather upset because Socrates was really the largest, he always was in these arguments, the largest guy standing in the room, except one, the Parmenides, where he was beaten up by Parmenides. So, you have all these contradictions in Socrates. So I wonder about this caricature of Western philosophy as being somehow representative of a particular view where the last guy, the last idea standing in the Republic is this idea that is taken up and as being somehow representative of all Western philosophy. To me, that it just doesn't fit the facts.
No, I think that's right, and I probably wasn't sufficiently careful in laying out that Arendt was telling a story, right? Arendt was telling one story that can be told, and she makes a very clear distinction, and again, it's a distinction that fits her story between Socrates and Plato, right? So what she saw, and I had it in one of my quotes, was that whereas Socrates located truth in discourse, in this back and forth of discourse, it was Plato, and she has this kind of socio-philosophical analysis that it was after Socrates died that Plato decided that was just too dangerous, that Plato moved from the discursive model of truth as an ongoing project to a metaphysical notion of truth. Now, you're probably a far better classicist than I am, but I don't think that she was claiming, and I kind of said in a footnote in my paper that she had a much more subtle reading of Plato as well. I mean, she distinguished between the work of the philosopher who goes in wonder to the transcendental ideas and the work of the philosopher king who brings those transcendental ideas back as the yardsticks against which we should measure ordinary experience. But I think, it is a danger, and it happens in Arendt scholarship, that we have the kind of picture of as if this was the tradition of Western philosophy, which begs the question, where did she get her ideas from? Right? You don't just kind of come out of nowhere. So there is of course another tradition through Western philosophy, just like there's another tradition through theology, right? There's ontotheology, but then there's also discursive worldly theology. So she was telling a story in order to make a polemical argument. And I think, all thinkers do that.
Thanks for your wonderful lecture on Hannah Arendt's thoughts. And really, Hannah Arendt is one of the thinkers I really admire for his wonderful contribution to the pathology of human need in his understanding of the political life as an integral part of humanity for our life. So back to the quotation on your screen, do you have particular reading or observation how Hannah Arendt would perceive the future of humanity in an age that maybe he considered the humanity is actually bogged down to some the atomization or the rationalization of alienation, for example. Yeah.
I feel like I'm being put on the spot of what would Arendt say? Always a dangerous thing to do. What would I say from my reading of Arendt? I would say it's up to us, right? She analyses certain developments or trends, but she also says the miracle is that all the time the new is possible, right? So what she calls natality. At any moment, we can bring the new into existence. That's the miracle of being a human being, right? That I'm not just determined by whatever trends. Of course, she was highly sensitive to the way in which our subjectivity is constituted by the world in which we live. But we always do have this capacity for it to be different. And, I think that as well as the atomization of which we're also keenly aware, there are also forms of solidarity and possibility of conversations and endless resources. There's a beautiful line of hers where she says it's always important to be careful of the company you keep, including amongst the dead. We have endless resources of thinkers to whom we can enter into a conversation to reinvigorate that possibility of the world being different. I think if you're not pessimistic at the moment, then you probably got your head in the sand. But pessimism isn't the same as hopelessness. And pessimism can also be a kind of shot in the arm of reality to motivate the urgency of the situation. So, I don't know what she would say, that's what I would say.